大家好，
大家好，
又到咗我哋讀你聽嘅時候，
是
我哋繼續讀呢個遠大前程啊，狄更斯嘅遠大前程，讀到第31節啦。我哋今次第30節錄音啦。咁第31節發生緊咩事啊？之前
30節發生咗阿 Pip 同 Herbert 喺度傾偈，即係 Herbert 話咧，其實有冇婚約在身啊？我都唔知啊，要搞清楚咁咯。最主要就係呢一個啦。
其實見完 Miss Havisham 之後，咁佢阿 Pip 就應該翻倫敦嘅喎。不過翻倫敦之前咧，佢係做咗啲咩咧？佢就
寄咗啲嘢俾阿 Jo 嘛。係
啦，同埋佢諗住去個
On the way。
係啦，即係食完早餐啊，諗住出去行下 countryside 咁樣。咁其實佢有冇心去揾阿 Jo 應該就冇嘅。佢應該冇提到揾阿 Jo，但係即係行下咯。但係咁樣行下會撞到阿 Jo，或者撞到識得阿 Jo，或者佢只識得嘅人出唔出奇？其實唔出奇。所以其實佢某程度上係想見呢啲人嘅，某程度上，但係佢唔知會發生咩事。咁結果發生咩事啊？就係即係又係嗰種階級嘅錯摸啦，有一種階級嘅隔膜喺度啦，而令到阿 Pip 感覺得好唔自然。最尾都係離開。咁翻到去倫敦發生咩事啊？就係原來有個 play 睇喎。係有個 play， 咁嗰個場所咧就叫 Denmark，OK 呢個地方。咁有個 play， 咁啊 play 咧就同呢個 Mr. Wopsle 啊，即係佢以前識得嘅嗰班人係有啲關係，因為佢哋寫嘅或者佢哋搞嘅。咁佢哋有飛送嘅，送咗飛俾你睇。搞笑。好嘛，咁而家就講阿 Pip 就有啲旁枝末節嘅嘢做下啦，即係呢一刻唔係去揾 Estella， 唔係去揾 Mr. Jagger
可能會幫到嘅，
而係去睇 play。咁唔知嘅，可能睇 play 嗰陣時又會撞到啲人啊，會聽到啲咩消息啊，唔出奇嘅。
或者個 play 啟發咗。
係啊，可能。咁睇下個 play 發生啲咩事啊，好唔好？
好。
On our arrival in Denmark, we found the king and queen of that country elevated in 2 armchairs on a kitchen table, holding a court. The whole of the Danish nobility were in attendance, consisting of a noble boy in the wash leather boots of a gigantic ancestor, a venerable peer with a dirty face who seemed to have risen from the people late in life, in a Danish chivalry with a comb in its hair and a pair of white silk legs, and presented on the whole a feminine appearance. My gifted townsman stood gloomily apart, with folded arms, and I could have wished that his curls and forehead had been more probable. Several curious little circumstances transpired as the action proceeded. The late king of the country not only appeared to have been troubled with a cough at the time of his disease, but to have taken it with him to the tomb, and to have brought it back. The royal phantom also carried a ghostly manuscript round its truncheon, to which it had the appearance of occasionally referring, and that too with an air of anxiety and a tendency to lose the place of reference, which were suggestive of a state of morality. It was this, I conceive, which led to the shades being advised by the gallery to turn over, a recommendation which it took extremely ill. It was likewise to be noted of this majestic spirit, that whereas it always appeared with an air of having been out a long time and walked an immense distance, it perceptibly came from a closely contiguous wall. This occasioned its terrors to be received derisively. The Queen of Denmark, a very bosom lady, though no doubt historically brazen, was considered by the public to have too much brass about her, her chin being attached to her diadem by a broad band of that metal, her waist being circled by another, and each of her arms by another, so that she was openly mentioned as the kettle drum. The noble boy in the ancestral boots were inconsistent, representing himself, as it were, in one breath, as an able seaman, a strolling actor, a gravedigger, a clergyman, and a person of the utmost importance in a court fencing match, on the authority of whose practiced eye and nice discrimination the finest strokes were judged. This gradually led to a want of toleration for him, and even on his being detected in holy orders and declining to perform the funeral service, to the general indignation taking the form of nuts. Lastly, Ophelia was a prey to such slow musical madness that when, in course of time, she had taken off her white muslin scarf, folded it up and buried it, a sulky man who had been long cooling his impatient nose against an iron bar in the front row of the gallery growled, "Now the baby's put to bed, let's have supper," which, to say the least of it, was out of keeping. Upon my unfortunate townsman, all these incidents accumulated with playful effect. Whenever that undecided prince had to ask a question or state a doubt, the public helped him out with it, as, for example, on the question whether 'twas nobler in the mind to suffer, some roared yes and some no, and some, inclining to both opinions, said, "Toss up for it," and quite a debating society arose. When he asked what should such fellows as he do crawling between earth and heaven, he was encouraged with loud cries of "Hear, hear!" when he appeared with his stocking disordered. A conversation took place in the gallery respecting the paleness of his leg, and whether it was occasioned by the turn the ghost had given him. On his taking the recorders, very like a little black flute that had just been played in the orchestra and handed out at the door, he was called upon unanimously for Rule Britannia. When he recommended the player not to saw the air thus, the sulky man said, "And don't you do it neither, you're a deal worse than him," and I grieve to add that peals of laughter greeted Mr. Wopsle on every one of these occasions. But his greatest trials were in the churchyard, which had the appearance of a primeval forest, with a kind of small ecclesiastical wash-house on one side and a turnpike gate on the other. Mr. Wopsle, in a comprehensive black cloak, being descried entering at the turnpike, the gravedigger was admonished in a friendly way, "Look out, here's the undertaker coming, to see how you're getting on with your work." I believe it is well known in a constitutional country that Mr. Wopsle could not possibly have returned the skull, after moralizing over it, without dusting his fingers on a white napkin taken from his breast. But even that innocent and indispensable action did not pass without the comment, "Waiter!" The arrival of the body fall was the signal for a general joy, which was much enhanced by a discovery, among the bearers, of an individual obnoxious to identification. The joy attended Mr. Wopsle through his struggle with letters on the brink of orchestra and the grave, and slackened no more until he had tumbled the king off the kitchen table and had died by inches from the ankles upward. We had made some pale efforts in the beginning to applaud Mr. Wopsle, but they were too hopeless to be persisted in. Therefore we had sat, feeling keenly for him, but laughing nevertheless from ear to ear. I laughed in spite of myself all the time. The whole thing was so droll, and yet I had a latent impression that there was something decidedly fine in Mr. Wopsle's elocution. Not for old association's sake, I'm afraid, but because it was very slow, very dreary, very uphill and downhill, and very unlike any way in which any man in any natural circumstances of life or death ever expressed himself about anything. When the tragedy was over and he had been called for and hooted, I said to Herbert, "Let us go at once, or perhaps we shall leave it." We made all the haste we could downstairs, but we were not quick enough either. Standing at the door was a Jewish man with an unnatural heavy smear of eyebrow, who caught my eye as we advanced, and said, when we came up with him, "Mr. Pip and friend," identify of Mr. Pip and friend confessed. "Mr. Walden Garver," said the man, "would be glad to have the honor." "Walden Garver?" I repeated, when Herbert murmured in my ear, probably Wopsle. "Oh," said I, "yes, shall we follow you? A few steps, please." When we were in a side alley, he turned and asked, "How did you think he looked?" I dressed him. I don't know what he had looked like except a funeral with the addition of a large Danish sun or star hanging around his neck by a blue ribbon that had given him the appearance of being insured in some extraordinary fire office, but I said he had looked very nice. When he come to the grave, said our conductor, he showed his cloak beautiful. But, judging from the wing, it looked to me that when he see the ghost in the Queen's apartment, he might have made more of his stockings. I modestly assented, and we all fell through a little dirty swing door into a sort of hot packing case immediately behind it. Here Mr. Wopsle was divesting himself of his Danish garments, and here there was just room for us to look at him over one another's shoulders by keeping the packing case door or lid wide open. Gentlemen, said Mr. Wopsle, I am proud to see you, I hope, Mr. Pip. You excuse my sending round. I had the happiness to know you in former times, and the drama had ever had a claim which has ever been acknowledged on the noble and the affluent. Meanwhile, Mr. Waldengarver, in a frightful perspiration, was trying to get himself out of his princely sables. Skin the stockings of Mr. Waldengarver, said the owner of that property, or you bust him. Bust him, and you bust 35 shillings. Shakespeare never was complimented with a finer pair. Keep quiet in your chair now, and leave him to me. With that, he went upon his knees and began to flay his victim, who, on the first stocking come off, would certainly have fallen off backward with his chair, but for there being no room to fall anyhow. I had been afraid until then to say a word about the play, but then Mr. Waldengarver looked up at us complacently and said, Gentlemen, how did it seem to you to go in front? Herbert said from behind, Capitally. So I said, Capitally. How did you like my reading of the character, gentlemen? Said Mr. Waldengarver, almost, if not quite, with patronage. Herbert said from behind, Massive and concrete. So I said boldly, as if I had originated it, and must beg to insist upon it. Massive and concrete. I'm glad to have your approbation, gentlemen, said Mr. Waldengarver, with an air of dignity, in spite of his being ground against the wall at the time, and holding on by the seat of a chair. But I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Waldengarver, said the man who was on his knees, in which you're out in your reading. Now mind, I don't care who says contrary. I tell you so. You're out in your reading of Hamlet when you get your legs in profile. The last Hamlet, as I dressed, made the same mistake in his reading at rehearsal, till I got him to put a large red revolver on each of his shins, and then at that rehearsal I went in front, sir, to the back of the pit, and whenever his reading brought him into profile, I called out, I don't see no wolfers, and at night his reading was lovely. Mr. Waldengarver smiled at me, as much as to say, a faithful dependent. I overlooked his folly, and then said aloud, My view is a little classic and thoughtful for them here, but they will improve. They will improve. Herbert and I sat together. Oh, no doubt they will improve. Did you observe, gentlemen, said Mr. Waldengarver, that there was a man in the gallery who endeavored to cast derision on the service, I mean the representation? We basically replied that we rather thought we had noticed such a man. I added, he was drunk, no doubt. Oh dear no, sir, said Mr. Wopsle, not drunk. His employer would see to that, sir. His employer would not allow him to be drunk. You know his employer? Said I. Mr. Wopsle shut his eyes and opened them again, performing both ceremonies very slowly. You must have observed, gentlemen, said he, an ignorant and blatant ass, with a rasping throat and a countenance expressive of low malignity, who went through, I will not say sustained, the role of Claudius, King of Denmark. That is his employer, gentlemen. Such is the profession. Without distinctly knowing whether I should have been more sorry for Mr. Wopsle if he had been in despair, I was so sorry for him as it was, that I took the opportunity of his turning round to have his braces put on, which jostled us out at the doorway, to ask Herbert what he thought of having him home to supper. Herbert said he thought it would be kind to do so, therefore I invited him, and he went to Bernard's with us, wrapped up to the eyes, and we did our best for him, and he sat until 2 o'clock in the morning reviewing his success and developing his plans. I forget in detail what they were, but I have a general recollection that he was to begin with reviving the drama and to end with crushing it, inasmuch as his disease would leave it utterly bereft and without a chance or hope. Miserably I went to bed after all, and miserably thought of Estella, and miserably dreamed that my expectations were all cancelled, and that I had to give my hand in marriage to Herbert's Clara, or play Hamlet to Miss Havisham's ghost before 20,000 people, without knowing 20 words of it. 呢個完全係一個即係離晒題啦，即係同佢嘅主軸冇乜關係啦，純粹係睇個 play， 然之後就咁啊 Pip 同 Herbert 就係又唔好意思批評佢 friend， 咁同埋即係其實呢啲咁嘅細嘅團咧，其實嗰啲觀眾咧，即係其實佢形容啲觀眾咧有一大部分就係、即係台上講幾多，台下又講幾多，即係不停喺度嗌啊、叫囂啊，即係台上面有陣時有啲講啲對白出嚟，啲自問自答嗰啲咧，樓下就會幫佢答啊，梗係啦，梗係冇啦，即係咁樣咧，即係説明嗰啲咩？説明咗嗰啲觀眾嗰啲水準啦，説明咗佢嘅劇團嗰個場地嘅問題啦。你咩場地咪吸引到啲咩人咯？你吸引到啲咩人咁嘅反應咪就係咁咯。咁個反應就好明顯，有陣時會 over， 甚至乎 overwhelm 咗個表演啦。咁但係 Miss Wopsle 呢個時候即係咪改咗自己嘅名佢？咪改咗自己嘅名，咁啊係啦，即係改個藝名啦，所謂改個藝名。我以為佢係寫，原來佢自己上台表演埋。咁啊，因為問佢你覺得我表演成點啊？咁啊 Herbert 就好識 do 喎，唔知點解，咁就好滑頭咁樣話正到爆啦 ，solid 啦 ，concrete 啦，capital 啦，即係講到哇正到癲啦咁樣啦。咁但係呢個Volden Gava 咧即係呢個 Wopsle 咧都係話，你冇留意到有個人喺度不停喺度想踩我台咩？咁樣啦，咁啊佢哋話冇啊，咁但係其實就我識得嗰個人嗰個 employer 啊咁樣，咁然之後就係竟然係會識啊咁樣，咁然之後到最尾阿 Pip 都有啲可憐呢個 Wopsle 啦，然之後就同佢去飲酒啦，係咪？同佢飲酒啦，同佢傾偈啦，開解下佢啦。其實 in a way 我覺得 Dickens 點解要寫呢啲人咧？我覺得係因為 Dickens 身邊有好多呢啲人。Dickens 自己寫嘢，咁佢身邊有一啲劇作家或者演員啊，有呢啲咁樣嘅遭遇啊，唔出奇咯。我覺得純粹係寫呢啲，即係佢認為比較真實啲嘅嘢，佢個人經歷，但係就同呢個故事本身就真係冇乜直接關係啦。呢個真係純粹一個離題萬丈。咁佢翻到去，咁佢都不忘要提一提翻 Estella 啊，但係佢提翻 Estella 純粹係阿 Pip 經歷咗今日，即係覺得即係覺得好 miserable。咁佢覺得自己都連帶覺得自己都好 miserable。呢個原因就係因為咩？就係因為阿 Pip 呢一刻對於自己嘅前景都係點樣？好模糊，佢都唔知道究竟佢同 Miss Havisham 啦、Estella 嘅關係會係點啊？佢嘅前程係點啊？到而家都係乜都唔知，好冇？好啊！我哋下次再繼續啦，希望佢快啲拿翻去主題啦。本書其實過咗一半，咁我希望快啲進入一個快速啲嘅正軌。即係我好想知道阿 Pip 究竟要用啲乜嘢以為生咧？因為到而家為止佢都好似無所事事咁樣。咁即係喺嗰個年代到佢呢個年紀，係，但係佢都要揾食㗎嘛。即係我覺得佢呢個年紀喺呢個年代其實真係要做緊嘢㗎嘛。咁雖然我都唔知阿 Herbert 做緊啲乜，但係阿 Pip 真係要知道自己要做咩咯。就算你係要同 Estella 結婚，你都係要準備啲嘢，咁你都要做嗰啲嘢。都係工作嚟，係咯。咁佢要揾到自己嘅，但係我個人覺得佢最好其實應該揾咗自己嘅工作先。同 Herbert做生意又好，定唔知自己揾啲咩做好，然之後 along the way 就係去撮合自己咯，同 Estella 咯，咁咪差唔多咯，係咪啊？好啦，咁啊睇下之後會發生啲咩事啦。 好，下次再講，拜拜。